If you've worked hard to save money, and we all know that land's not getting any cheaper, it can be daunting. It can be overwhelming to kind of look at a transaction or a property, fall in love with it, and then start doing the math and saying, hey, I'm going to have X amount down. You know, if I go to a bank, I'm going to have to put this much down, and I don't know if I can afford that. And you know what? This land's 40,000 and I only have 30,000, or I only have 20,000 or 10,000. And I'd love to buy this piece, but I only have 10,000 and it's 40,000. How could this ever work? And you just quit. Well, let me tell you how it could work. How seller financing can work for you is when you go to a seller and you're willing to get creative with them. This fits when the seller oftentimes when I work with a seller in a land deal, you'd be surprised how many sellers don't owe a mortgage and haven't owed a mortgage for a long time on a piece of property. Or if they do owe a mortgage, they owe like way less than what they're going to ask from you and like way less than what, the property's worth on the market today. So there is equity. That word, that beautiful, clean, powerful word, which means there is some meat in that deal. They've got equity in that property if they have a low mortgage. This is where seller financing can really, really work. And when they have no mortgage and it's free and clear, then I'm really wanting to talk about seller financing with the seller. We'll talk later about why it helps them. But for you, let's say you have 10 grand and you're trying to buy a piece of property. That's, let's just say 50 grand. And you think, well, the bank, they're going to want 20% down. Well, what's 20% of 50 grand? And I'm, guys, if you already have all this figured out, just go ahead, tell it to us. It is 10 grand. Well, 20% down. If you have 10 grand, you've got it. But let's say you don't. Let's say you've got 5 grand, but you got 5 grand saved, but you can afford a monthly payment that it would take to mortgage that property at $50,000 at a bank. You could go to the seller and you can say, hey, listen, I think your price is fair. I will give you the $50,000. I'm going to ask that you finance this property to me. And this is where we're going to get into the weeds. And why I love seller financing so much is because the seller at this point would become the bank. They get secured. If they do this with you, they get secured with a security instrument that I always use, a title company. The title company would prepare 2 instruments, a promissory note, which is essentially you promising in about 3 to 5 to 10 pages. You're promising to pay this note. And if you don't pay this note, they can foreclose on you. And then it gets better. They then have a security instrument called a mortgage, just like the bank would have a mortgage, or in some states it's called a deed of trust. But that is a recorded lien that would then go against the property. So back to your conversation with the seller. You say, hey, I can give you the $50,000. I'm going to ask you to finance this property to me. And why this can work, we'll go to the seller next, but there's so many benefits why this could benefit the seller. If they have no basis in this property, meaning they owe nothing on it and there's no basis in this thing. There's a ton of benefit to why seller financing could benefit them, but we'll get to that in a second. For you, you could structure a deal with them where they say, yeah, we would be willing to finance it to you. You can put $5,000 down, which is, let's say you're 10% down, $5,000 down on this property. And I would argue that when you build this promissory note and you and the seller get to talk about the terms of your financing agreement, this is why I love seller financing. You get to make the rules. When you guys play the game together, you get to make the rules. So it's not some bank terms that have all this red tape and all these things that we'll talk about that could be advantageous to only the seller versus you as a buyer. I'm going to ask that the seller, I get a lower interest rate than what I would get at a bank. Hey, I'll give you your price. But I always say, if I'm going to give you your price, then it has to be on my terms. And my terms would be that I put $5,000 down on this $50,000 purchase. I'd like to finance it with you at 5% interest. And I'd like the note to be for 30 years, a 30-year term. But here's the big kicker. Here's how you can start to reel that seller back. Because, of course, they're going to be like, well, duh, why wouldn't anyone want that note? You're getting less interest from me than the bank and less money down than you have to put at the bank. Why would I do this? Well, instead of just a 30-year term, you can do like a 5-year term, a 5-year balloon inside of that term. You could do a 3-year balloon, 2-year balloon, 1-year balloon. This is one of my favorite deal structures, is to do a note with the seller where you have a 30-year payment plan. Okay. But it has a 12-month balloon in the note. And I know we're jumping right into the weeds right out of the gate. It's just how I roll.